We're now going to look at the individual bones of the skull. We have here a model that we're going to be looking at, and I have also with me our workbook, which you should have downloaded and printed. And now we're on page 5 of the workbook, where we're looking at the cranium from a frontal viewpoint. We're also going to be looking at page 6, where we're going to be looking at the occiput, the frontal, the sphenoid, the temporal, the parietal, which are the bones that make up the casing of the brain, as well as the mandible, the maxilla, and the zygomatic, which are the bones of the face. And we're going to be looking at later on individually each bone in a different video and identifying where they're located and what bones they articulate with. But to start, let me just give you a brief overview. And here we have Mr. Cranium. And I'm going to show you that our occiput is the bone that is in the back of the head. When we're working on our client who is lying on her back, often we're going to be working on them in this position. And this is the bone that is involved in the prime moving of the sphenobasilar symphysis, which works along with the sphenoid. The sphenoid is our red-colored bone here on our model, which is just at the very front. It has a very small surface area through which we can contact it, and very often when it comes to actually contacting, working on the occiput in relation to the sphenoid, we'll be holding our cranium on our patient in this manner. Next, we have our frontal bone, which is colored here in blue. Now, as you can see, the frontal bone is actually quite large. It makes up half of the orbit of the eye, and it articulates with the parietal bones, which have been colored here in green. The parietal bones, as you can see, are actually quite large. They're paired bones, which means there's 2 of them. And when we're working on a client, we're actually often contacting the parietals in this manner. Next, we have the temporals. The temporals are also paired bones. We've got 1 on either side. They are the areas in which the ear is embedded. And as you can see, there's a smaller area called the mastoid process just behind the ear. You can feel it on yourself, as well as a larger area that we call the squamous process, or the body of the temporal. And very often when we're working on the temporal, we're going to be either holding it in this manner or sometimes in this manner. And we're going to be working on both temporals very often either simultaneously or one at a time. Next, we have our bones of the face. We have our mandible here, which, as you can see, inserts into what we call the temporomandibular joint, meaning that it articulates with and it inserts into the temporal. The temporal has a little area that juts out called the zygomatic process that actually articulates with what we often commonly know as the cheekbone, but are actually called our zygomatic bones. And we also have the maxilla, which is the bones just above the mouth surrounding the nose area, as well as the bones within the nose proper, and also the ethmoid, which will be deep in here, which we'll look at another time. So this gives you a quick overview of the bones of the skull, and now we're going to go ahead and look at each bone individually, how it articulates with the other bones, where it's located, and specifically how to go about identifying for its bony landmarks when you come to working on a client, and being able to establish where each bone is located so that you can properly contact it, because we're all shaped differently, and you'll see that on different people of different ethnic origins, some people's occiput is very wide, some people it's very narrow, so you'll have to modify your point of contact of your hand. On some people, the frontal is very wide, others very narrow. And so we'll need to know exactly how to locate where the bones are to make sure that if we want to, let's say, be contacting the frontal bone, that we're not actually doing this, which is actually having our fingers touching the parietal when we want to be specifically on the frontal. The same thing with the occiput. When it comes to working on the occiput, you want to make sure that you're not holding the skull like this or holding your patient like this, which means that what you're actually doing is you're contacting the parietals at the same time as the occiput. So let's go on to each individual video where we'll look at each bone and we'll help you figure out where they're located and the best way for you to hold and contact them.